The morning Corporal Yale Dobbin found the hatchlings. She had been awake for 31 hours straight. That detail matters. Not because exhaustion is an excuse for what happened next, but because what she did, what she chose to do with every rational instinct screaming at her to retreat, came from a place beyond calculation. It came from the part of a human being that operates when the thinking brain has finally gone quiet, when the body moves before the mind can veto it. The Dracovath Accords had been signed 11 months earlier. 11 months of fragile bureaucratic peace between the Galactic Compact and the Dracovath sovereignty. The oldest spacefaring civilization in the known cluster, a species that had been building orbital empires when humanity was still arguing about the shape of continents. The Dracovath did not dislike humans. Dislike would have required them to think about humans with any sustained attention. What they felt was something closer to the mild wariness one might feel opening a container of something unknown. Probably harmless, possibly unpleasant, best handled with care and kept at manageable distance. The Accords had established a joint zone, a stretch of 3 uninhabited systems designated as neutral territory where human and Dracovath forces would conduct what the diplomatic language called cooperative security operations. What that meant in practice was that human soldiers patrolled one half of each system and Dracovath warriors patrolled the other, and they communicated through translation arrays that introduced a 4-second lag into every sentence, which made every conversation feel like 2 people shouting at each other from opposite ends of a tunnel. Yale's unit, 9 soldiers from the 14th Colonial Defense Detachment, had been assigned to the rocky, nitrogen-heavy moon designated Joint Sector 7, informally called the Shelf by everyone who had to live on it. It had gray dust that got into everything, a 17-hour day cycle that matched no human sleep rhythm, and a wind that came down from the northern ridgeline every evening like something with a grievance. The Dracovath patrol zone began approximately 40 kilometers east. In 11 months, there had been 3 official coordination meetings, 22 translation array communications, and exactly 1 face-to-face encounter, when a Dracovath border scout had approached the edge of a marked perimeter to stare at Yale's squad for approximately 90 seconds before turning and walking away without a word. The Dracovath communicated a great deal through silence. Humans had not yet learned to read it. What Yale knew about Dracovath biology she had pulled from the Joint Service briefing files, which were themselves assembled from compact xenobiology assessments that were themselves translated from Dracovath public documents, which meant the information had passed through approximately 4 layers of institutional filtering before reaching her. The broad strokes were intact. Dracovath were large, average height of nearly 3 meters when fully upright, though they preferred a low, 4-limbed gait on open terrain. Their skin was layered in overlapping scale plates that ranged from deep copper to near black, thermally regulating and structurally dense enough to deflect most small arms fire. They were warm-blooded, long-lived, estimated 2 centuries of active lifespan, and organized their society around lineage clusters called hearthlines. Hearthlines were not quite families and not quite nations. They were something in between, carrying both biological loyalty and political obligation in the same bonded unit. The briefing files mentioned in a single paragraph near the end that Dracovath reproductive cycles were rare and strategically significant. A Dracovath clutch, a group of hatchlings from a single hearthline, was not merely a biological event. It was a civilizational one. A new clutch represented the continuation of a lineage that might be thousands of years old. The loss of a clutch had historically triggered conflicts lasting generations. The paragraph ended with a note: hatchlings are not to be approached under any circumstances. See Rules of Engagement Appendix F. Yale had read Appendix F. She could still recite the first 3 lines. The rest of it she had absorbed the way you absorb information that feels theoretical, important in the abstract, untethered from any physical reality you expect to actually encounter. She encountered it at hour 31. She had been running a solo boundary check, not regulation, but her commanding officer was 20 kilometers west dealing with a communications relay failure, and she was covering ground he couldn't. The shelf's northern ridge had been flagging anomalous thermal readings for 2 days. Nothing conclusive, probably a vent pocket, possibly equipment drift. She went to look because she was the kind of soldier who went to look. The ridge cracked open at its eastern end into a shallow depression. Not quite a cave. More like the land had been folded once and then left. She almost missed it. The wind was loud and she was tired, and the light was in that particular gray-amber phase of the shelf's evening that flattened depth and made distances unreliable. She saw the thermal bloom on her scanner first. Irregular. Clustered. Organic. She crested the ridge and looked down into the fold. There were 4 of them. Dracovath hatchlings, none older than a few days by the look of them, their scale plates still soft and translucent at the edges, their copper coloring muted to something almost pale. They were clustered together in the hollow with the automatic, unthinking precision of things that knew warmth was survival and had not yet learned anything else. They were not moving much. One of them was making a sound that Yale's translator rendered as static, but that her nervous system translated without assistance into something it recognized across every biological boundary there is: distress. She stood very still. Her first thought was tactical, her second was biological. Her third arrived before the first 2 had finished forming, and it was not a thought so much as a recognition. These animals were cold, they were alone, and one of them was going to die before morning if nothing changed. The rules of engagement said, do not approach. The briefing said, hatchlings unattended are a hearthline crisis situation. Any contact is a political incident. Her own training said, you are one corporal 31 hours without sleep on a nitrogen moon, with a personal sidearm and no backup, and whatever left these 4 here is either gone or coming back, and either answer is dangerous. She stood at the top of the ridge for what she would later estimate was approximately 40 seconds. Long enough to run every calculation she was capable of running. Long enough to reach the end of the calculation and find that it didn't close, that there was no version of the numbers that told her to walk away and feel nothing about it. She climbed down into the fold. She moved slowly. That mattered enormously. Though she didn't know exactly why at the time, she moved slowly because she was frightened, and because they were clearly frightened, and because some part of her that predated language understood that speed was predator behavior, and she was not, in this moment, trying to be a predator. She kept her hands visible. She was aware that the hatchlings could not read the gesture, that it was culturally meaningless to them, but she did it anyway because her body needed something to do with the fear. At 2 meters distance, 3 of the 4 hatchlings reacted. They pulled together tighter, the scale plates on their backs rising in a defensive ruffle. The 4th, the one making the sound, didn't respond. It was on its side. She could see the irregular flex of its breathing. She stopped. She crouched down slowly, bringing herself to their level, and she stayed there. 30 seconds. A minute. The wind came down from above the ridge, and she turned her face into it without looking away from them. She had no food to offer, no heat source beyond her own body, which was running warm with exertion. She had nothing useful. She had only what she was, which was a human being kneeling in gray dust in front of 4 terrified alien animals, and she stayed there because leaving felt like a choice she couldn't make. After 3 minutes, she reached into her kit slowly, every movement telegraphed, and removed her thermal blanket, the kind every soldier carries for field emergencies, reflective on one side, insulating on the other. She unfolded it, which made a sound that caused all 4 hatchlings to flinch. She stopped, waited, unfolded it the rest of the way. She laid it on the ground in front of her, not reaching toward them, just putting it there. The 4th hatchling continued its labored breathing. The other three watched her with eyes that were copper-ringed and enormous in their young faces. Eyes that processed light differently than hers, she knew, that saw her in heat spectrum as much as visible, that were reading her in ways she couldn't fully account for. She held still and let them read. 7 minutes after she laid the blanket down, the largest of the three mobile hatchlings stepped onto it. She didn't move. 2 minutes later, the second one followed. She stayed crouched in the cold until her knees were aching through her suit lining and her 31-hour tiredness had settled into something below thought. Something that was just the mechanical fact of staying in place, of not leaving, of existing in the fold in the rock beside these four small things that had no context for what she was, and had decided, in whatever way creatures decide things, that she was not the worst option available to them. She never touched the fourth hatchling. She understood on some level that it was beyond what she could fix. When it stopped making the sound, she registered the silence and felt it in her sternum, the way you feel a door closing in a house you're trying not to think about. She remained where she was. This is the part the compact diplomatic record would later struggle to categorize. The Dracovath Guardian returned 4 hours later. Yale's scanner picked up the heat signature when it was still 600 meters out. Adult, large even for a Dracovath, moving in a way that she had no data set for, but that her body correctly identified as the movement of something operating on emergency purpose. She stood up slowly. The two hatchlings on her blanket did not scatter. They stayed. The Guardian crested into the fold and stopped. Yale has since described the Dracovath Guardian as standing in a way that changed the air. That is not a tactically useful description. It appears in her debrief report nonetheless, because it was the truest thing she could find. The Guardian's scale plates were fully raised, its chest expanded, the bioluminescent nodes along its jaw, which, she would later learn, were used in Hearthline challenge displays, had activated and were burning a deep arterial amber. It was, by any objective measure, preparing to kill her. She did not run. Her sidearm was at her hip, and she did not reach for it. She held both hands open at her sides, and she looked at the Guardian directly, which she would later learn was technically a dominant signal in Dracovath body language, though she had no way of knowing that in the moment, and she did not look away, and she did not move, and the two hatchlings who were still alive were pressed against the backs of her boots. The Guardian looked at her. It looked at the hatchlings. It looked at the small, still shape of the fourth one. It looked at the thermal blanket, which was now anchored under 3 sets of small feet, including the Guardian's first instinctive step into the fold. It looked back at her. 40 seconds. 50. The bioluminescent nodes shifted. She did not have the knowledge to interpret what they shifted to. She would learn later from the formal diplomatic briefing that followed the incident, which was attended by people with considerably more stars on their collars than she had, that amber shifting to a pale flickering gold in a Dracovath Guardian's jaw nodes was not a display that had been recorded in any joint service cultural documentation, because it was not a display that occurred in formal or diplomatic contexts. It was a Hearthline internal signal. It had no official translation. The closest the Dracovath liaison officer was willing to offer after considerable discussion was that it indicated a situation requiring reassessment, specifically the recognition that a prior assumption had been wrong in a way that carried weight. The Guardian lowered itself onto its haunches, a posture the briefing files classified as non-aggressive. Yale stayed exactly where she was for another 2 hours. The Guardian stayed too. The hatchlings eventually moved from behind her boots to somewhere between the two of them. Not choosing exactly, just existing in the space that had become, through no deliberate design, shared. At some point in that second hour, she sat down in the dust because her legs had given her the final notice that they were done with this. The Guardian watched her do it. She did not look away. She had stopped being afraid in the precise way she had been afraid at the beginning. She was still afraid, the kind of fear that lives in the walls of the situation rather than the center, but it had become a background fact rather than the primary one. When relief finally arrived, her unit's lieutenant, Davin's emergency beacon having triggered the moment she'd climbed into the fold and activated it herself, it arrived alongside a Dracovath Border Patrol unit that had been tracking the Guardian. There were humans on one side and Dracovath on the other, and Yale sitting in gray dust in the middle with two hatchlings that had fallen asleep against her thigh. The after-action documentation ran to 40 pages. The diplomatic correspondence ran considerably longer. The Dracovath sovereignty filed an initial protest, a standard Hearthline sovereignty violation notice that was downgraded within 72 hours to what the Compact Translation Service categorized as a formal inquiry pending context review. The Guardian filed its own account through Hearthline channels, which the Compact was not officially privy to, though fragments reached the diplomatic record through informal means. The account described a creature. The translation the Dracovath used was one that typically referred to small predators that had abandoned a hunt, or perhaps more precisely, to predators that had discovered something they chose not to kill, that had remained stationary in the cold for 4 hours with no tactical advantage to gain. It noted the absence of weapons deployment. It noted the thermal covering. It noted that the creature had not left when leaving was still safe. It noted that one of the clutch had died during the interval, and the creature had not left then either. The Hearthline did not have a category for this. That is the detail that traveled furthest through Dracovath diplomatic channels. Not the gesture of the blanket, not the physical stillness, not the open hands. The fact that the human had stayed after the fourth hatchling died. A threat assessing an unwinnable situation would have used the moment of loss as cover for departure. A creature operating on calculation would have recalibrated. Instead, Corporal Yale Devon had remained in a cold fold of rock with a dead hatchling and 2 living ones, and a grief she had no biological obligation to feel and had made no apparent movement toward resolving. The Dracovath did not fully understand human grief. They understood mourning. Hearthlines had elaborate mourning structures for clutch loss, multi-layered and ancient. But Dracovath mourning was for their own. The idea that a creature from outside a Hearthline, from outside the species entirely, might sit with the loss of a hatchling it had known for 4 hours and feel something that made it unable to leave was not a concept that fit cleanly into any framework they had developed. Several Dracovath scholars in the subsequent months would argue that it should not have been called grief, that it was more likely instinctive protective behavior that had misfired across a species boundary, that the human had simply not had enough information to leave. The Guardian, in its Hearthline account, did not agree with this interpretation. It had watched the human's physiological signals for 2 hours. It had seen the respiration change. It was old enough to have seen grief many times in many members of its own Hearthline. It noted, in language that the Compact translators found difficult to render precisely, that the creature's stillness had not been the stillness of waiting. It had been the stillness of having already decided. Yael received a written reprimand for violating the boundary provisions of Appendix F. She received it, signed it, and returned to duty on the shelf, where the wind still came down from the northern ridge every evening and the dust still got into everything. Her lieutenant, who had filed the reprimand under direct order from the regional command structure, told her privately that it was the most expensive piece of paper he had ever signed. The political impact of the incident took 18 months to fully register. The Hearthline of the Guardian, a lineage called, in rough Compact translation, the Deep Copper Ascendancy, one of the 7 oldest Hearthlines in the Dracovath sovereignty, formally requested a Compact liaison officer be assigned to the joint zone. Not a diplomatic officer, not a negotiator. They requested a soldier from Yale's unit. This had never been requested before. The broader Dracovath sovereignty response was slower and more complicated. There were factions within the sovereignty that interpreted the incident as proof that humans were erratic and unpredictable and therefore dangerous, and they were not entirely wrong. and they said so in terms that the compact found difficult to disagree with. There were other factions that found themselves in the uncomfortable position of trying to categorize a species that had just demonstrated, in a single incident, the capacity to behave in ways that served no individual survival interest, no strategic advantage, and no territorial logic, and had done it reflexively without apparent deliberation, simply because something small and frightened was in front of them. The most honest Dracovath assessment, contained in an internal sovereignty report that the compact would not see in full for another 6 years, concluded that the incident at Joint Sector 7 had revealed something that the 11 months of Accord's implementation had failed to surface. Humans did not parse threat the way the Dracovath did. Dracovath assessed threat by vector and scale. Large, fast, armed threat. Small, slow, vulnerable. Not threat and not relevant. The calculation was clean, and it had served them well for a civilization spanning centuries. A human corporal on 31 hours without sleep had looked at 4 small, vulnerable, alien creatures and walked toward them, not because she assessed them as threats she could defeat, not because she assessed them as assets she could use. The report's conclusion, rendered with visible difficulty into language, was that the human had appeared to operate from an entirely different primary question. Not what is this to me, but something closer to what does this need? The report flagged this as requiring further study. It flagged it as potentially the most destabilizing characteristic in the compact species catalog. Not because it was violent, not because it was strong, because it was genuinely structurally unpredictable, because a civilization whose foundational impulse could not be resolved in the clean threat assessment or clean indifference was a civilization that would never behave exactly as modeled. The report did not recommend hostility. It recommended something the Compact Translation Service spent 3 weeks arguing over before settling on the word attention. You'll never read the report. She completed her rotation on the shelf, was reassigned to the 14th base on the Compact's border station, and spent the next 4 years doing the work of a soldier in a peacetime joint zone, which is to say, quiet and repetitive, and occasionally punctuated by the kind of bureaucratic friction that makes you question your career choices. She requested and was granted transfer back to the joint zone twice. Her official reason was familiarity with the terrain. Her lieutenant, who knew her well enough by then, did not ask for a different answer. The 2 hatchlings she had sheltered that night were named in the Deep Copper Ascendancy's Hearthline record. Naming in a Dracovath Hearthline is not a small thing. It is the formal acknowledgement that a life has been welcomed into the continuous thread of lineage, that it is real and remembered and bound. The names given to the 2 surviving hatchlings were compound designations, as Dracovath names typically are, containing within them a reference to the circumstances of their first confirmed survival. The Compact's translators worked on the compound element for some time. The best rendering they arrived at was not a word, but a phrase. The one who stayed. The Deep Copper Ascendancy sent an unofficial communication to the Compact Joint Command, not diplomatic in form, not bound by Accord protocols, filed simply as a Hearthline notation. It said that the names had been given so that every member of the lineage who spoke them would be reminded of what had happened on the shelf. It said this was important because the Hearthline believed that what had happened on the shelf was the kind of thing that should not be forgotten, because things that are forgotten tend to be repeated as mistakes. It said one more thing in the careful, formal language of a very old civilization, choosing its words with full awareness of their weight, that the Hearthline had reconsidered its assessment of the human species, and that the reconsideration had not produced certainty, and that this absence of certainty was itself the finding. They did not know what humans were. They had been certain they did. The event on the shelf had not told them what humans were. It had shown them that they did not yet know, and that the not knowing mattered more than any previous conclusion they had drawn. Yael Devon did not receive a commendation. She did not receive a promotion from the incident. She received her reprimand, and she received, 3 years later, an unofficial visit from a Dracovath diplomatic aide who arrived at the border station with no scheduled appointment and requested, through the translation array, to speak with a soldier from Sector 7. She met the aide in the station's small coordination room, gray walls, fluorescent equivalent lighting, the universal aesthetic of places where bureaucracy happens. The aide was tall even by Dracovath standards, its scale plates a warm dark copper. It sat across the table from her and was quiet for what felt like a long time, but was probably 30 seconds, which is nothing in a species that lives 200 years. Then it placed on the table between them a small flat disk of dark material. Hearthline worked, she could see, the surface etched with continuous fine marks that the aide told her, through the translator, constituted a recitation of the deep copper ascendancy's lineage. The aide said that the disk was not a diplomatic gift. It said that Hearthline objects were not given diplomatically. It said that a disk of this kind was given when a Hearthline wished to acknowledge that someone outside the lineage had, regardless of their origin, affected the thread. It said that the two hatchlings were well, then it left. Yael sat in the coordination room for a while after. The disk was cool and smooth in her hands, and the etching was finer than she could fully see, layer after layer of marks that meant a lineage older than her civilization, older than her species' memory of writing, and somewhere within it now, pressed into the record by whatever hand had made this, a reference to a night on a cold moon when nothing important happened except that one soldier made the decision not to leave. She turned the disk over once, and then she put it in her chest pocket close to where her heartbeat was, and she went back to work.